Riku's HP loss from the acid was notable. Of the 4 elements, he was damaged the most by acid. That said, the actual percentage of HP loss was still low. Through the analysis of every bit of intel he had, Riku must have had defense-focused job classes. He was probably around level 90. In any case, the best strategy is to use acid attack. Ah, that hurt. Nuisance. His anger flared up as his thoughts were interrupted, but then a miracle occurred. He managed to perfectly bat the katana flying towards him away with his staff, causing Ainz's non-existent eyes to whiten. The spear was blown away as if the knockback effect had activated. How? This staff's knockback effect had all kinds of activation conditions placed upon it. First of all, blocking a warrior's strike with the staff would not trigger the effect. The effect would not trigger at all if the staff was not used offensively. If an opponent blocked the attacker's blow with a sword or shield, its effect would not trigger. It would only trigger if one were to land a blow on their opponent's body with it. A sword or shield would obviously not count as an opponent's body. That was why the effect would still trigger if one were to strike an opponent's gauntlet. So what happened to Riku's katana? Given the aforementioned conditions, it could be deduced that the floating weapons counted as a part of the wielder's body. But that would not make much sense. Sebas had retrieved weapons from the capital in the past. There were floating weapons used by a dancer. The weapons were analyzed in detail when they were sent to the treasury, and judged to be simple floating weaponry that obeyed commands to attack in a semi-autonomous way. It should only count as equipment, which meant that if this staff were to strike the dancer's weapon, the knockback effect should not trigger. If the knockback were to be applied on equipment, only weapons like female sensei's Iron Fist of Wrath would be able to pull it off. That was a weapon that had the sole purpose of creating shockwaves when the wielder punched the air. As a weapon that applied knockback to everything, it could also apply knockback on equipment. But this staff was nowhere near as powerful as that weapon, so why was it able to do such a thing? From these series of tautologies, he deduced the answer. Riku's weapons counted as a part of his body. I see. Ainz had 2 hypotheses around the mechanics behind this. First was that Riku's weapons were creatures like Intoma's blade bugs. If he were like that sword Saint Golem, it would make sense why the knockback effect was triggered. The other hypothesis, the more likely one, was that the weapons were not equipment at all, but were actual parts of Riku's body. This would be a similar situation to how the knockback effect would still apply if the staff strike was to be met with a dragon's claw attack. He'd have felt that the weapons had HP too, but thought that it was because they counted as Riku's equipment. It was a mistaken assumption based on the fact that they took damage when Riku took damage. It appeared as though those were separate health bars, so that moment felt like an eternity to Ainz in his confusion. What if he used those methods? But would that be the correct decision? No, wrong, that would be a mistake. Ainz felt the elemental skull cast the 10th tier divine spell, 7 Trumpeter, and immediately cancelled the cast. He had to reaffirm his role in all of this. Ainz silently cast a message as Riku retreated as if he was chasing after the knockback katana. The katana then returned to its original position. So if the weapons were to be separated from Riku by a certain distance, they could no longer move. Or was his opponent trying to make him think that? Or was he just shocked that it was knocked back? We more or less understand each other's powers. That's good enough. Riku slashed towards Ainz as he glided along the ground. He did not intend to speak. Ainz grumbled deep down at that fact. It made sense for his opponent to wish to make the most of his time. To answer one's opponent in battle would be a foolish action. So while he respected Riku's commitment to his strategy, he was still annoyed that his opponent was ignoring him. Wait, I haven't finished. Ainz, in the midst of Riku's attacks, threw his staff behind himself. He could see that Riku was slightly confused. Ainz kneeled down immediately. Wait. Please wait. Listen to me. The greatsword in Riku's hand stopped on its way to Ainz's head. Because he was immune to critical strikes, he was not worried about lowering his defenseless head. He gave an order to the elemental skull at the same time. I did not mean to clash with your excellency. This whole thing started because the kingdom stole the grain that was meant as food aid to the Holy Kingdom. Between them and us, the greater evil should be obvious. What does your excellency think? That we were the greater evil? You went too far. There had to be better ways to deal with that. Ainz raised his head. Riku's greatsword remained suspended. It seemed like he had no intention to strike him at the moment. That is because your excellency was not the victim. How would your excellency have dealt with this? When the grain that your countrymen toiled to produce was stolen away. If you did not have the power that you have, things would not have turned out this way. People with power have to be careful about how they use their power and take responsibility for their actions. I, for one, protect the world. Indeed. This world is under my protection. Upon hearing his opponent's rhetoric, Ainz thought, this dumbus is finally talking. He was being a silent listener. Some people preferred audience response during their speeches while others did not. From his self-righteous tone, Ainz could tell it was best that he kept quiet. Ainz took mental notes of everything he said. The deeds of those who gathered around my loving mother were wrong. They were wrong in the same way that father was. In the end, absolute power corrupts absolutely. It is the source of all faults. Ainz observed Riku in silence, calming his breath as much as he could. Riku was being impassioned. Ainz should not be as rude to interrupt him. To be honest, Ainz could not understand what Riku was talking about at all, but at the same time he did not sound like he was just rambling nonsense. He should have at least spoken in a way that a layman like Ainz could understand. Although the root of every wrong could be traced back to us, I will not seek forgiveness for that. I cannot allow you to continue on your current path of destruction. That is why. Perish. Whoosh, the greatsword swung down. Perhaps he felt guilty for executing the defenseless Ainz. The sword was swung at a much slower speed than before. Hold up, please reveal some more intel while you're in a good mood, Ainz almost said out loud. His opponent did not intend to speak anymore, so there was no need to keep up this boring act. The battle continued. The elemental skull, which he had commanded to be on standby, rushed into the greatsword's trajectory and took the hit. This was an effective use of a summon because the elemental skull was no longer of use to him. That was why this was the right choice. If say, this was against Shultier's spewed lance, he would not have done that. However, since Riku's weapon did not have life-steal abilities, he could freely use summons as sacrifices. So this was all your fault. Are you not in the wrong then? Ainz let out a pitiful cry. Who was them? What did they do wrong? Ainz could not understand it all, but if he phrased his response this way, perhaps Riku would expose some more intel. It was worth a try. Perhaps he really was feeling guilty. His movements were much tardier than before. Ainz capitalized on this opportunity to roll backwards. The elemental skull rushed in between them. Block him. The elemental skull cast its spell while Ainz yelled. Riku ignored the skull and charged for Ainz. The elemental skull attempted to stop him, but due to his size and the lack of skills to do so, it failed. Wall of Skeleton. Ainz cast his spell to erect a wall to keep both Riku and the elemental skull on the other side. How pathetic, Sorcerer King. Riku bellowed with anger. Perhaps his fury was because Ainz had left his summon on the other side of the wall so he could escape, but it did not matter to Ainz. If a magic caster was not behind someone but stood alone, it would be no different from suicide. It would be worse then. He could have easily flown over the wall, but Ainz felt that Riku was attacking both the elemental skull and the wall. Compared to the elemental skull, the wall of skeleton wasn't too durable. It crumbled immediately at Riku's strike. The elemental skull had cast multiple Vermilion Nova S to reduce Riku's HP, but to defeat him would be a tall order. It could be because of his job classes, but his magic resistance was abnormally high. Given that was the case, Ainz cast a spell on Riku. Temporal Stasis. This was a 9th tier single target spell. Although the spell could prevent the opponent from moving, it also prevented them from taking any damage while the spell lasted. That was why it was usually used when there were multiple hostiles. However, Ainz found that his spell was not just resisted, but nullified completely. It appeared that Riku had time-stop countermeasures. Of course, that was not too unusual given how strong he was. At the same time the greatsword was swung towards Ainz, the hammer was also swung towards the elemental skull. Ainz sank the greatsword's damage and as a precaution, cast greater break item on the other weapons flying towards him. It was not just resisted, but nullified again. So it was true that the weapons counted as Riku's body. As the elemental skull took a massive amount of damage, Riku looked into the air in panic. A figure was rapidly descending. It was Albedo. Ainz heard Riku let out a sound that could not even be defined as a sound. He was absolutely stunned. As Riku shook, Albedo approached him. Her speed was on par with one of Or's arrows. And then, "You bastard!" While that terrifying roar was heard, the halberd named 3F was swung down with the intention to split Riku's head open. Riku raised his greatsword and spear and a cross to block her attack. The impact created by 3F was sizable, as both of Riku's feet were sunk into the ground. In the next moment, Riku was blown away to the side. Albedo had stomped her foot onto Riku's chest. The armor let out a pitiful clang. "You insect. How dare you disrespect Ainz-sama. Unforgivable." Albedo's declaration caused the air around them to quake. She began attacking afterwards. The distance between the two was closed in an instant, as Riku received an attack with enough force to send him into orbit. The sound of metal clashing together rang out at an ear-piercing volume. Riku used 2 of the floating weapons to block this attack. He flew backwards with all of his strength. Not with a jump, he flew back without his feet touching the ground. "Albedo, stop. That is enough." Ainz halted Albedo, who was about to follow up on her attack. That was enough, he should not allow Albedo to fight any longer. Understood. While her glance told him that she was unhappy, Albedo still stopped moving. It was probably correct to assume that he no longer wished to fight. Riku began ascending to pull some distance between them. Albedo stood silently by Ainz's side, using her own body as a shield against Riku. She was probably on alert for long-range attacks by the enemy. Agni Dana. I will say it again. Become my subordinate. How about it? I will give you everything you have ever wanted for. His proposal received no reply, yet Ainz continued on. How regretful. Still, the doors of the Sorcerer's Kingdom are always open to you. You may come to visit any time you want. After he said that, Ainz lowered his voice to say to Albedo, do you think he still wants to fight? No. I do not think he wants to anymore. But, if he is not retreating, it might be best for us to defeat him right here. If we both attacked at the same time, it should not be too difficult, right? Well, he should not have heard their conversation. Riku disappeared nonetheless. The barrier he had erected also melted away. Ainz was not sure if he had teleported before taking down the barrier or vice versa, nor could he tell where he ran off to. Although there were still things that had to be investigated, Ainz felt as though they had successfully completed their mission. Good grief, that's one less thing to worry about. Good work. I am not worthy of such praise. There still might be people surveilling us. It is best for us to return to Nazarick first. Ah, let us do that then. After recalling the elemental skull, Ainz cast greater teleportation to retreat with Albedo.